Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Ordinarily, war is not right. It's against the virtue of charity, and not because he's fighting and killing other people. But sometimes, for good reasons, it's all right to fight one. And I guess the major idea is that if a greater good is going to come out of it, if by fighting this war you ensure freedom for a larger number of people, for example, that the killing and the violence and destruction that goes on can be tolerated as a second sort of effect while you're trying to create this better situation.
Joining Father Bacik in today's reflection is Father Richard Virgil, pastor of St. Joan of Arc Parish in Toledo, Ohio. Today's reflection focuses on the topic of registering for the draft. Here's Father Bacik.
Well, Dick, I'm glad to have the chance to talk to you on this program, especially since we spent a number of years working together at Bowling Green State University as campus ministers there. And one of the problems that we ran into back in those days, and which is coming to the fore again, is the question of the registration for the draft. And young people making decisions about the question of whether they were going to go along with the draft or whether they were going to be conscientious objectors and so on. I find young people coming to me again and asking for guidance and help on that kind of question, especially the 19 and 20-year-older who is faced with that particular question in terms of registration for the draft. And very often they want to know what our Christian community says on that question. They need to try to formulate things in their own mind. I often suggest that they try to write something out and try to research the question to find out what the religious tradition that we belong to has said throughout the years, what options are open, and so on. So I thought, since that is a live question again, that perhaps we could speak a little bit about that.
Yes, we were together during the years when this issue became very prominent on the campuses, of course, the late 60s. And I think I got quite an education from a number of the students at that time. When they went through their own experience, I think I tended initially to just respond with some of the things that I had learned from a study of morality, and I guess I had never applied in a very practical way. And when they began to really speak with sincerity of the things that they saw, not just things they were reflecting from the newspaper relative to the Vietnam War or things that were happening out in Berkeley, but their own personal insights relative to war, and this particular war, it was an educational experience for me. And I became very convinced of what grew out of that, which is selective conscientious objection today. But the issue is coming up again, and I'm glad that we have that background to draw from in helping people today to address that particular issue.
Yeah, I'm finding that very helpful, and I remember those days myself, and it was educational, because many of those people we dealt with were very sensitive individuals, and I thought at the time very sincere individuals.
Definitely.
Of course, we also dealt with many people who took an opposite viewpoint, didn't we? People who were very ready to go to the military. We knew people well who were in the armed services and who served their country in that capacity and did so out of strong religious convictions as well. So there's no doubt that we saw both sides of that lived out in the young people that we dealt with.
Yes.
I remember in one case going to the draft board with a young man, sort of going through the whole business of having to write out one's position and trying to justify it in terms of the Christian tradition and opting for a conscientious objector position and trying to argue that in front of the draft board. And it was quite an enlightening experience. I found the people on the draft board to be very receptive at that time, very sensitive kind of people, very interested in the well-being of young people, and very ready to listen to what the religious tradition had to say on it.
Well, I'd like to I don't think that was my experience. My experience was that I found that the draft boards that I had to deal with any particular student, and I didn't have to do that very often, but I found the draft board people to be a little suspicious that these students are just trying to get out of what they saw as their civic duty, that it was a requirement that these students just automatically, if they're drafted, go to the war. And I think there was that suspicious attitude in society that if a person is objecting, that he's somehow or other cowardly or un-American. And I'm glad that you stressed the point of the sincerity. Christianity has been somewhat ambivalent on the whole notion of war. We've started out, I think, in the early days of Christianity of being very much committed to pacifism. But then as time went on and situations changed, there was a commitment to the just character of war, that certain wars not only could be tolerated, but they were very good and just, and there was a moral duty to participate in them.
That's just worthwhile going back and looking a little bit at that tradition, because when you go try to apply for a conscientious objector status these days, you do have to show that in your religious tradition that this is a legitimate position. And I guess what we're saying in general is that if we look at the Christian tradition, we're going to see two distinct positions, right?
Yes.
We're going to see a pacifist position that's against all war and against violence, and on the other hand, you're going to see a just war theory. So maybe we can go back and look at that a little bit now. So if we start out with that pacifist position, because it appears as though that is the earliest tradition, because you go back to the New Testament period and you get that statement Jesus made from Matthew 26:52, where we read, Jesus warned that those who use the sword are sooner or later destroyed by the sword. You know, and Jesus has that whole idea that he comes to bring peace and so on, that he's a peacemaker. And I think the early Christians took that teaching of Jesus very seriously. That idea of Peter, put away your sword. You know, we're not going to fight them that way. And, you know, I think along that line, when there was a group available that Jesus could have joined up with, the Zealots. The Zealots at that time were in favor of fighting off the Romans through military means. And evidently even one of Jesus' followers, Simon the Zealot, was a member of that particular grouping. But Jesus didn't go that route, didn't join up with the Zealots. In fact, apparently explicitly rejected that kind of position. So it seems as though the early Christian people really picked that up. And my understanding of it is that they generally, throughout the Roman Empire, didn't get involved in the fighting. They were sort of objectors already in the first 3 centuries. They were not generally involved in the wars of the Roman Empire.
Well, there are other factors that are involved there. One would be that the Christians are a minority group. They represent a small segment of the society. And another is that the society was a pagan society. The Roman society was committed to things that they could not adhere to. And to fight in the pagan society was somehow or other to admit the pagan gods and the principles upon which that society was based. So there were some conflicts of conscience that were built into the culture of the day that the Christians had a difficult time with. As Christianity grew and became more of a majority element in society, and as that pagan culture became Christianized, then their outlook on war took a more realistic position, I would say.
They saw it seems to me, as part of their civic duty then to defend the Roman Empire, which sort of represented the culture and the better life against the barbarians. They thought that was part of their duty to defend that, and it seemed like a more viable option to them, or in many cases the proper thing to do.
Yeah.
And I guess then we begin to get that whole idea of the just war theory, don't we?
Yeah.
That other side of it, that yes, you can justify war. I'm thinking back then that probably reaches one of its important formulations in Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, right, where I guess Aquinas said that a war would be just. I mean, ordinarily war is not right. It's against the virtue of charity. You're not supposed to be fighting and killing other people. But sometimes, for good reasons, it's all right to fight one. And I guess the major idea is that if a greater good is going to come out of it, if by fighting this war you ensure freedom for a larger number of people, for example, that the killing and the violence, the destruction that goes on can be tolerated as a second sort of effect while you're trying to create this better situation.
Yeah, the just war theory, I think, grew out of the theory of self-defense, that if someone wants to kill you, you don't have to let them kill you, that you can defend yourself to whatever extent is necessary, and if the means at hand are such that you have to kill that person to save your own life, then you would be allowed to do that. Self-defense within a realistic boundaries, and sometimes those you get in a situation where the only thing you can do is kill the other person. And that was transferred to whole nations, to defend the nation. If somebody wants to be an aggressor and take your country or take away your freedom or take your people, you can defend yourself. You don't have to sit by and let that happen. So the just war theory grew out of the Christian understanding of self-defense.
Yes. At an individual level. I mean, individually you could protect something and in that way. And that nations could function in the same way then.
Right.
Yes. I think then as we move into modern times, the situation begins to change, or a new light is put on this whole discussion, mostly because of nuclear weapons. That this seems to create a new way of looking at war, because they are so destructive, because of all of the trouble that comes from them and the great loss of human life and what it would do to the question of being able to live on this planet of ours. So that I noticed that a lot of religious leaders begin in the 60s and into the 70s to talk about war then in a little different way. They seem less ready to just quickly say yes to a just war theory. Do you have that same impression?
I think that there are a lot of moralists who write in the 60s and in the 70s who would say that we have outlived the just war theory, that there's no way that you can justify nuclear warfare, using nuclear weapons of any type because of the massive and extensive destruction that's associated with nuclear wars. But here lately, I think that there have been some moralists who feel that the just war theory still has ingredients that can help us formulate a new moral position, that we don't just throw out the baby with the bathwater, but that we try to build on what we have inherited in the way of our Christian understanding again, that we can develop principles relative to nuclear warfare. So one moralist said, well, we look at World War II and the pattern bombing that occurred where the United States or the Allies tended to, their thrust was to demoralize the German people by regular pattern bombing. And we felt that that was all right. So if the destruction comes from 100 bombs, what's the difference whether you get the same result from one bomb, which would be nuclear warfare? I'm seeing some ambivalence in what is happening today among the moral theologians. But there are those who say, scrap the just war theory and let's start over again.
We have to say that a young person looking at this question realistically today and having to make decisions really still has two viable options, right? To adopt a conscientious objector position, either totally or in regard to a given war, or to adopt a just war theory, which says that it would be legitimate to fight for good reason.
Yes.
And perhaps part of that trend then is I'm thinking of a quote from John the 23rd in Parchment Terrace, and he said he was criticizing the arms race, and he said that it is irrational to think that war is a proper way to obtain justice for violated rights. I think that's often quoted as moving more towards a pacifist kind of position. That it's sort of irrational to think that war is going to be a way of dealing with our problems today. And I think, again, that grows out of this great sense of the amazing destruction that would be unleashed in the world if we did have an all-out nuclear war. It's hard to imagine what the world would look like after that, or what good would result from all of that. But I think no matter how far you go in that direction, as I see it in the Christian world today, that the just war theory still is in place, right? And
I think so.
A young person can legitimately follow that.
That's right. It becomes a good guide for that person in formulating his conscience, I would say, the just war theory.
Yes. So I wonder if we have clarified it enough. Is there more that we need to say about the just war theory and how it operates? I've been stressing this proportionate good, right? That something better has to result as a result of this destruction and so on. Is there more to it?
There are other ingredients to it, but I think when you speak of that, you have hit the major element in the just war theory, the proportionality. The moralists in formulating the theory speak of the need to have a just cause and that your intention is right and you don't use means beyond that which are necessary to achieve your goal. But the proportionality, I think, is the major ingredient in the just war theory.
It's interesting to hear what the pacifists are saying these days, I think. they're trying to look at the whole problem in a different way. I think they're trying to say that we need to put more of our time and energy in on creating a better social condition in our world, that what really causes war is a lot of the injustice that we find in the world, inequity, people starving and not having their rights and so on, and this is what sort of creates the tension towards war situations. And I think that they keep advocating that more of our money and energy, time, resources be spent on creating a better world and making life more livable for people so that people won't feel the need to go to war to vindicate their rights and so on.
Well, I don't think anybody would deny that, but is it an either-or situation? If everybody in the world were committed to doing those kinds of things, then we together undertook that project, then it would work. But we live in a world where there still is a significant number of people who have the greed for power, and therefore you have to take a balanced approach. The same thing that brings about war brings about riots in Miami or wherever. So sure, we have to address those situations, the poverty level, the social justice questions. But I don't think that simply addressing those questions is going to eliminate war right now.
Right. The problem is, again, you're stressing the realism of the situation. Greed is part of our situation, and the struggles between the superpowers is part of the real world, and there are nuclear weapons and all of those things. That's the reality. Yeah. It seems like always that's the problem in morality, isn't it, that the gospel message runs up against harsh reality. I use this example, and I really don't know if it's legitimate, but Jesus said to turn the other cheek. But when he was in the situation, someone struck him, he didn't just turn the other cheek. He said, "Why did you do that?" He challenged them, which is interesting to me anyway, that I'm not sure what significance it has entirely, but it does suggest what you're saying, that the high ideals of the Christian outlook keep running up against harsh reality, where people hit you in the cheek, and people want to take your clothing and do you in and so on. And it's that kind of world that we have to live in. And I guess that's the side that the advocates of the just war theory keep pushing, right? That kind of realism.
Being realistic about it, that there is greed. There's greed in business, small business, large business. There's greed among peoples of nations in the world. So you're going to have those tension situations, and you have a right to prepare to defend yourself and your freedom. And if someone's going to be aggressive and try to take those away from you, you have a right to defend yourself. The rest is good. We have to live out the Christian gospel, sure.
Let's talk about this conscientious objection thing that is going on now. As our present laws are constituted, a young person needs to be a total conscientious objector in order to validate his claim. In other words, he has to say, in order to achieve this status legitimately, he has to say he's opposed to all wars.
All wars.
And in other words, in our legal setup, there is no provision for a selective conscientious objection. Now, I notice that many religious bodies, including the Catholic bishops, are advocating a selective conscientious objection. They think that that is a proper kind of situation. I suppose in our own memories, we think back to the difference between World War II and the Vietnamese War in terms of the response of the American public. So in the World War II, and thinking of Hitler and the great menace that seemed to be to the entire world, most people were thinking, well, it is proper to fight that war. We need to. We need to keep the world safe for democracy and keep Hitler from taking everything over. And then some of the same people, in looking at the Vietnamese War, ended up saying, well, it doesn't seem right to us. We're over there in another country. The issues are so cloudy, it's hard to know what we're doing there. And therefore, they said, well, I would fight in World War II, but I would not fight in Vietnam. It somehow highlights this question of selective conscientious objection. And I think that really is proper from a moral viewpoint. If it's true that we have to follow our own conscience, and if it's true that wars would have a different sort of moral character to them, and some would be more just than others, then it seems proper to say that I ought to be able, as a citizen, as a believer, to make a judgment about a given war, whether I think it's moral or not.
Mm-hmm. There again, you run up against the reality of what is a country going to do that has a right to defend itself. That puts a responsibility on the citizens of the country to participate in the just defense that country can undertake. this is a real challenge. I would not like to be the legislator and have to try to formulate a law that recognizes selective conscientious objection, although I think that has to be done. I believe it's right, as you say, that we do recognize selective conscientious objection, but to get that to express that in legal ways is a very great challenge.
Very difficult thing. We really haven't found a way of doing that yet.
Found that,
but the religious leaders keep pressing the politicians, the governmental people, to try to do that, to formulate this so that we give room for the young people who find themselves opposed to a given war to have a legitimate legal way of trying to work out their position there. It's amazing the kind of emotions that are generated about that selective conscientious objection. I was talking to a group not long ago about this topic, and I know you've done similar things on many occasions. I was telling them, it happened to be a group of Catholics for the most part, and I was telling them what the bishops were in favor of and the whole history of pacifism in the church, and they got very upset about it. Many of the men were veterans of World War II, had fought for the country and felt very strongly about it, and had been heroes in their own right, and done something, I'm sure, that was tremendously good and of high moral standards for them and so on. And they felt the kind of thing that you were indicating again. I think that well, where's the country going to be if we just let people make these decisions? And why aren't people ready to fight for the country like I did a number of years ago? And they were very upset with this notion of selective conscientious objection. And I felt the strong emotions, and I wanted to be empathetic with those people because I think I understand what that grows out of. I mean, those men gave of their own lives, their own, there was all kind of self-sacrifice in that, and I think very often high purpose. And I suppose one thing you would like to try to get across to them would be the sincerity of young people who are making that decision, and that maybe it's not all that easy to go in that direction of conscientious objection, and it requires a lot of trouble with family and with neighborhood and peers and all of that. And very often it was a decision made at great price, really.
Yeah. Well, I think that the people who fought in World War II are people who feel, as you, I think, accurately described, that this was a very just war and a noble thing to do, and they responded to the call of their country. Many of those people felt that the moralists who began to challenge, even in that war, had no right to do that. That the cause was so clear that we could do certain things that we wanted to do in that war, such as the pattern bombing in Europe, the dropping of the atom bomb, that all of those things were right. We could demand of a country unconditional surrender. And there were moralists who were challenging and saying some of the things being done by the Allies are wrong. And those moralists in this country were looked at as somehow or other being un-American. What they were simply trying to do was to apply the gospel and to say that even though your cause is right, it doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to do. The beginnings of some objection and selective objection to even a otherwise justified war, I think are rooted in World War II. They come to a head in the Vietnamese War. And I think that we have that experience to draw from, and that now we have to try to crystallize that, have to try to formulate that in some way. The Catholic Church's recognition of selective conscientious objection really was only formulated in the relatively recent past, primarily as a result of the Vietnamese War. I think the roots were there for our position in the past, but it didn't develop until the Vietnam War came along. But it's real, and it's important, and we have to recognize it in law.
As we continue to counsel young people today, then, we're going to have to try to educate them to these various points, aren't we? I mean, young people have a right to know our full Christian tradition on this. They have to know that from the thrust of the gospel, that really Christian people are supposed to be peacemakers in some way, that we're supposed to be people who are trying to create a more harmonious world, that we do have high ideals about forgiveness of enemies and so on. They need to know the fact that there is a history of pacifism within the Christian community. The same token, they have the right to know about the just war theory and how it is operated and how important and good and noble people have worked it out in their own lives. And so part of what I guess we're continuing to do in this new period of the registration for the draft is to make that information available to the young people, to allow them to know the full heritage that they come from. And and as they begin to formulate their own positions, to do it not in isolation and not just out of whim or out of cowardice or something, lack of knowledge, but working really out of an understanding that they're part of a larger community that's addressed the question throughout history. Now, the question seems to have new overtones today because of the development of nuclear weapons and so on. But still, we have to tell them that they really have these two options before them, a conscientious objection position and also a position growing out of the just war theory, where they would have to make a judgment whether a greater good could come from fighting a particular war. So they're thrown back on their own conscience, but they're not in isolation. They have a larger community to enlighten and to support them.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion is Father Richard Wurzel, pastor of St. Joan of Arc Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's reflection was registering for the draft. If you have any questions about today's program, or if you have any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network in cooperation with the Diocese of Toledo.